because analysis can be so difficult for students to comprehend, for the first time. Hopefully this isn't the first time you're being exposed to analysis, but if it is, that's totally fine. But because it's so difficult, I thought I would provide an example for you. So what I have here is one of my favorite poems. It's one of the few I actually have memorized, but it really is one of my favorites. So it's pretty short, it's pretty simple, it's pretty sweet, but it is surprisingly rich and deep. And so I will use this tiny little poem to help you see just how many different meanings can go on in something so short. So the poem is called The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's it. That's the whole poem. And it was written by William Carlos Williams, which is the same author that you will be working with for the short story. He also wrote A Use of Force, which you'll be working with for essay number 4. So he wrote this in 1923. So take a look at it, read it again. It shouldn't take too long, but just kind of get a feel for this poem. It's nice because it's short, so I can work with it pretty easily here. Okay, so again, I absolutely love this poem, and here's why. Whenever you look at any piece of literature, there are many different lenses, like a glass lens, from a pair of glasses that you can look at a piece of writing through. So at the bottom, I have here a list of different readings. These are only 4. There are many, many, many different types of lenses that you can use to analyze a poem or a story or really anything. So these are just 4 different kinds of lenses that you can use to come up with a different reading of this poem. So the first one is form. I know that this isn't a lit class. We're not talking about poetry form, but you should be able to notice immediately how different this form is from any other poem that you might see. The first word is not capitalized. We do see that this poem is an entire sentence, just one sentence. You see that there is always 3 words on the first line. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on. You can also see that there's only 1 word on the second line, 1, 1, 1, 1. You can see that it's broken up into 4 2-line stanzas. Enjambment is when a poet interrupts a sentence, or not a sentence because this is one full sentence, but interrupts a natural break with a line. So much depends upon would be a natural line, but the poet cuts off upon and puts it on its own, forcing you to slow down and stop. Okay, so these are all different things that we are looking at in terms of form. We are analyzing this poem based on its form. What does it mean now? Now is when you take a leap into an interpretation, which becomes your argument about it. So perhaps this form is saying that even though the image it's presenting is simple, the complexity of the form forces the reader to slow down and find important elements within it. Perhaps the form is pointing out the importance of the barrow itself, or the water, or the chickens. Something like that. I'm not going to go too in depth with each of these readings, but can you see what I'm doing? If I were to do a simple summary of this poem, all I would say is this poem is about a red wheelbarrow that is covered in rain next to some chickens. Okay, that is a summary. When I'm analyzing, in this case in terms of form, I'm looking at how the lines are written. There's no rhyme. We could do rhythm if we wanted to, and so on and so forth. Okay, so are you starting to see the difference between analysis and summary? Summary just gives the very basic, information that you need to understand it. Form is looking deeper. Let's go further. So the next reading I have listed is the historical context. So this poem was written in 1923. What's going on about that time? About that time, we have World War I. we have the Great Depression, we have the Dust Bowl, at least in the general vicinity. I'm not saying that all of that stuff is occurring right at the second that this poem is being written, but it's about that time. So at that time, agriculture was huge, especially compared to today. Yes, there's a lot of agriculture going on today, but back then it was much more a way of life for so many more people. So when you take that reading to it and look at this poem as if it were written for the purpose of presenting that time period to its readers, what do you see? So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. Perhaps that is saying that a red wheelbarrow, though simple, is absolutely essential to the way of life of this country or the way of life for a particular family. It is emphasizing the need of that wheelbarrow in order for a farmer to do his job. And then, you know, the last two descriptions of being glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens is not as important. Okay, so if you look at it from a historical context, you can see that, oh, well, maybe this poem is about how important the simple tools of agriculture are in feeding a nation. Okay, something like that. That's a historical reading. So if we move on to the next one, the literary context, this one gets a little more complex. So in 1923, the literary movement that was going on in America, because Carlos Williams is an American poet, so in 1923, this poem was being written in the modernist movement. And one of the biggest elements of the modernist movement, some of the other modernists would be William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, those guys. So if you've done any reading of those types, they're in the same literary period at this time. Maybe John Steinbeck. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on John Steinbeck, but he's pretty close, if not right in there. Anyway, so the modernists have a whole bunch of different ideas, but one of the basic ideas of being a modernist writer is all about the image, just creating an image. Another big important thing, and by creating an image, I mean they simply describe something. There's a poem by Wallace Stevens that's written about a jar. It's called An Anecdote of a Jar. And that poem is simply about a jar sitting amidst a forest. So he's creating an image there. He is very descriptive on what that jar is doing and what's surrounding him. Williams is doing the same thing here. He's being very specific. It's a red wheelbarrow. It's glazed with rainwater, and it is beside white chickens. So he's being very specific. He's creating an image, even though it's very short. It's still quite specific in what it's saying. So he's creating this image. Now, what happens is that he is not providing the meaning of this image for you. He is simply providing the image, because the modernists believe that ultimately there is no meaning to anything. That if a reader takes meaning from their writing, it's from the reader, not the writer. Does that make sense? So modernists were really quite negative. They didn't find meaning in a whole lot of things. So going back to Anecdote of a Jar, Wallace Stevens was presenting the message that jar meant nothing without the surrounding trees. There was no way to describe where it was unless you used the trees. There's no way to describe its size, anything like that, without the use of the trees. So it was kind of a symbol of the entire modernist movement in that there's no meaning in the jar without the context around it. Okay, so if you find meaning in this poem, according to the modernists, it's coming from you, not the poem, not the author. It's coming from you. Okay, and that's probably my favorite reading of this poem. You can work as hard as you want to find meaning in this poem, but in the modernist era, there is no meaning in it. It's simply presenting an image, and whatever you find from it is coming from you, not the poet. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. It's a bit deep, but those modernists are a little weird, but I love them, and this is why. It's a very simple concept of, here's a poem. If you find meaning, good for you, because I don't mean anything. There is no meaning. That's what a modernist poet would say to you. So positive, isn't it? All right, so moving on lastly to the biographical context. Remember, these four lenses that I'm providing here are just the tip of the iceberg. There's you could do a psychoanalysis of the poem. There's so many different things you could do with it. But these four, I think, are just quite simple and easy to work with. So lastly, the biographical context. If you read, let's see here, no, it doesn't say it. So here's a little bit of biographical information about William Carlos Williams. He was a country doctor. So a country doctor, if you recall, is the type of doctor that goes from house to house. So he does not have an office where people come and visit him. He goes and visits his patients. So in the use of force, when you read that, you'll see, oh, he came to the little girl in her house. That's weird. No, it's not weird. At this time in history, again, going back to historical context, that's quite typical. So he was a country doctor as well as a poet in the modernist era. And so a lot of his poems come from his experience as this country doctor. So when you read The Red Wheelbarrow through the biographical context, it's simply an image, not the image like the modernist would, describe an image. It's simply what he saw looking out a kitchen window. So if you, let me start over. He was at a patient's house. He looked out the patient's window, and this is what he saw going on in the courtyard or the farmyard, wherever it was. So you have to think about, does that create any additional meaning to the poem? Could you use the biographical information, with the rest of it, with the historical perhaps as a doctor, which is the biographical aspect, he's looking out this window and he's reflecting upon the historical context and how important something as simple as a red wheelbarrow is. So sometimes you can join the two. But in this case, if you didn't know that Williams was a country doctor and that he saw scenes just like this every day of his work, you would think, oh, well, why on earth would he be writing about this? And, what does it mean? But when you look at the biography of it, it's just, for him, something he saw every day. And how that affects the meaning is something that you could determine. So I hope this has been helpful. There are just so many ways to analyze, and I think that's one of the most difficult things about analysis, is that there's so much that you can look at. We're trying to keep it pretty specific this quarter. We're just working with some literary examples, but you could analyze an advertisement, in a magazine. You could analyze a my brain's escaping me, a commercial, there we go, on TV. You could analyze, a novel. There's so many things you can analyze everything around you, and you'll start to see how much more meaning opens up and why the creators of those things do what they do. So hopefully this has shown you just how many different ways you can look at something as simple as this tiny little poem. It's so small and yet carries so much weight and meaning to it. I hope it helps, because it can be difficult. And I tried to pick a poem too that was from the same author of the short story that you'll be working with for your paper. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, happy analyzing.